What are the three key fantasy football questions facing the 2022 Baltimore Ravens as they head into training camp and the preseason? It's time to break it down right here and right now as we get another week with another team on Locked On Fantasy Football.
Are Locked On Fantasy, your daily NFL fantasy podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Greetings, everyone, and welcome to another edition of the Locked On Fantasy Football Podcast. As usual, I'm your host, Vinnie Iyer. When I'm not doing this, I'm writing about NFL and fantasy football for sportingnews.com. Not too long before all the training camps will open across the league. Everything will get hotter quite literally as we go to late July, early August. Time to think about fantasy football, drafts, and what we need to do to prepare. And we're still on our series here of looking at all 32 teams. We're down to 3 more divisions and 12 more teams. We're going to open with the AFC North today, so that means we'll focus on the first team in alphabetical order. That would be the Baltimore Ravens. If you missed our look at the AFC East 4 teams, we did that last week, and then we went through the entire NFC methodically here. So if you need to check out any of those teams and what we try to break down with those, check them out on our archives here on Locked On Fantasy Football. We're going to move forward here with the Ravens, and we're going to look at the Bengals, Browns, Steelers. So we'll get through that entire division and then start looking also at the AFC South and the Houston Texans. Not a lot of fantasy football prospects there, but we're going to get to every team. We're going to do it. The Ravens are definitely an intriguing team. They have some questions we want to find some answers to here in training camp and preseason. We're going to do our best to provide the insight here on what they might be thinking, what we need to know here for fantasy football about the Ravens. So looking forward to breaking down one of the better offensive teams in the league on today's show. Thanks for making Locked On Fantasy Football your first listen today. We're free and available to you on all platforms. This episode of Locked On Fantasy Football is also brought to you by BetOnline. BetOnline has you covered this season with more props, odds, and lines than ever before. BetOnline, where the game starts. All right, let's dive into the Ravens. And what we usually do is find a question about the quarterback, the running game, and the running backs, and then we look at the receiving core and the questions there. So that's what we've done for every team so far. And the Ravens' good place to start is quarterback. And is Lamar Jackson capable of rebounding and finishing as the top QB on the board here? He's right now QB number 4, but we want to know how high his ceiling can go. Now, it's interesting with Lamar Jackson. He's disappointed fantasy football owners, managers, since his breakout year as an MVP just a couple years ago. I think the thing that's happened is he's not been quite able to stay healthy. You've had COVID-19, where we know his status with the vaccination was a bit questionable. He's been on the COVID list multiple times. He's had some durability issues as well pop up with his running style. Last year was just a bit of a fluke injury there with his ankle, lower body, caused him to miss games. So the durability has come into question. Now you're wondering what his psyche might be as he tries to get that new mega contract from the Ravens. So there always seems to be something with Lamar Jackson. And on top of everything else, they made a big trade there, moving his go-to guy downfield, Marquise Hollywood Brown, to the Cardinals to reunite with his college quarterback, Kyler Murray. So a big offseason change for Lamar Jackson as he looks for a new contract, as he tries to readjust to get another remixed receiving core here. And we're not quite sure the state of the running game. They did, however, really upgrade their offensive line here. So the Ravens realized that they needed to get back to making that a strength, focused on that in the offseason. So really like what the Ravens have done up front and to really get that as an established strength again. So all the things are kind of lining up full circle for Greg Roman and John Harbaugh, trying to get them back to where they were in Lamar's MVP season, where they were a scoring machine. And part of the other difficult part was not having the healthy backfield. They had to move in guys, Devonta Freeman and Latavius Murray and Le'Veon Bell, and try to get some production there in the backfield by committee. It was hard to do that when you lost your 2 top backs, J.K. Dobbins and Gus Edwards. So It's been tough for Lamar Jackson. The one thing that has gone right for him is Mark Andrews. He's clearly his go-to guy as the number one tight end, and that hasn't changed. And he's a big source of Lamar Jackson's passing production. But now in the red zone, you lose some of the weapons there, and you're trying to adjust to a new receiving core. But Rashad Bateman, they did use a first-round pick on him, and I think he gave them confidence where they can move on from Hollywood Brown. That Bateman is a better, complete all-around receiver here. That's not just a speedy deep threat, but can scheme himself open, has a nice size, can run good routes, deliver good hands here for Lamar. So, look, when Lamar had his breakout MVP season, a lot of it was based on his rushing. And we know how much rushing means in fantasy football for a quarterback. It just changes the game. When you get a point for every 10 yards on the ground versus a point for every 25 yards through the air. So when Lamar Jackson can provide a little bit of both of that and put them together and bring the touchdown level high, that's what we saw there when he was the best fantasy football scorer not too long ago, just 3 years ago. So when you look at Lamar, I mean, I think he can have a special year. He's right now ranked consensusly, if that's a word, fourth behind the trio of Josh Allen, Justin Herbert, Patrick Mahomes. A lot of the rankings have Josh Allen one, then Mahomes and Herbert are interchangeable in a lot of the other places. But it looks like Lamar Jackson has kind of settled into a tier of his own here, where he blends the best of just established production, and we know he has that high level that he can push to the number one overall score as a QB1. And we know he has a very high floor because of that running ability, and that's why he hasn't been any lower than number 4 on the list in many places. So I really like Bateman and Jackson as a connection here, playing off Andrews. I think Bateman is a better receiver to complement what Andrews does here. And Marquise Brown was an occasional deep threat, and he could warm up here really fast. But you've got some speedy guys as well. Devin Duvernay moves up to the number 2 spot, so they have some real confidence that Duvernay will put together speed here. You also have James Prochet. So giving these young guys a chance here. They're number 2, number 3 on the current depth chart. Tylan Wallace is another guy they drafted. They moved on from Miles Boykin. So Boykin and Brown, 2 speedsters that they used to have, they just said, okay, we're going to change this receiving core, fit more what Lamar Jackson's strengths are. And Bateman, again, does that. And you don't give up some of that big play availability because you have Duvernay and Prochet to do some of that. Tyler Wallace was very productive there at Oklahoma State. So you get him as a number 4. It kind of drops off after that. So when you look at Jackson, I mean, Andrews and Bateman are going to his main source of production when he's not running the ball. So the key part, upgrading the offensive line, having that power running game working. Lamar plays off well, prolific backs there. So really looking good here for Lamar Jackson. Everything's lining up. Really, the only question is health, and we know we at least have a valuable backup here. So that should give you more confidence in going after Lamar Jackson. Now, some people have made the hot take that their backup, Tyler Hundley, can do everything Lamar Jackson can. They did plug in Hundley, and he looked like a Jackson clone in a short period of time. I think if over multiple games, if you had to go there, Hundley had to play like for a month, you'd start to see him exposed. But in a short period of time, like we saw a bit last year, a lot of the same things that you see from Jackson carry over to Hundley because they're not going to change a lot of the concepts of their offense here. So intriguingly, Brett Hundley, remember him? He's a former Packers backup to Aaron Rodgers, and then he went out to Seattle for a while. Well, now he's the third stringer. So they're trying to make sure this offense is fully kind of versed in guys that can produce the way that Jackson does. So that means not necessarily put up the same numbers, but being able to be plugged and played into this offense of Greg Roman and still handle some of the concepts there that they have for Jackson. So I do like that fact that you have Tyler Huntley. If you're a little bit worried about Lamar Jackson, and it's not a traditional move to make, but if it's a plug-and-play quarterback, and we've seen offenses throughout the years where you can put the second guy in, he's going to produce to somewhat of your level of satisfaction as a back-end QB1, borderline QB2, even if you're not getting that high-end QB1 production from your number 1 guy. I think you would have felt that way maybe with Mr. Trubisky, given that system behind Josh Allen last year. And it's hard to really just trust the number 2, but in this situation, you've seen a good chunk of Huntley play. You can see that he's going to put the ball in the hands of the playmakers. So that's going to help his numbers and help you recover a little bit if you invest a sizable pick on Jackson and you're worried about him staying healthy, hedge your bets a little bit by taking a late pick on Hundley and also looking at a pretty decent, durable handcuff in a traditional pocket passer. There's your QB2, someone with upside, maybe a Zach Wilson type there that you could draft and then have Hundley as the true insurance for Jackson. It's a little bit risky, especially if you've got limited roster spots here, but you could also just roll with Jackson and put in Hundley and then figure out waiver wire if Jackson is hurt at some point related to his bye. So all these things that you can figure out, but everything says you can hedge your bets on Lamar Jackson and be confident about taking him in that top 4 at quarterback in fantasy for 2022. All right, there's a good breakdown of the Ravens quarterback situation for you, specifically our MVP, Lamar Jackson. If he can get to that level, if he puts up MVP numbers, you know he's going to be an elite fantasy star and maybe push for the number 1 overall scoring spot. And we have definitely confidence that can return again here for the Ravens quarterback. Now, we will break down the Ravens backfield. There's a big question lingering over that group, and we'll take a look at that in our next segment. Before we do that, BetOnline.net is your number one source for all your betting needs and sports information. We told you at the top, this episode is brought to you by BetOnline. Find all the latest sports developments, league reviews, and news, including this year's hot stretch in Major League Baseball. We'll have the All-Star break, but then everything will rev up again as we head towards the postseason. BetOnline is your convenient source for all your sporting wagering information, including live betting, esports, and scores. And BetOnline.net remains the best spot for your sports scores, podcasts, and news this season. Don't forget about NFL futures, win totals. Week 1 is out there that you can check out, and we know it's a big time for the individual sports here. We had tennis and Wimbledon wrap up here. You're going to have soon the U.S. Open. You have also golf in full swing with multiple tours here, boxing, MMA. BetOnline.net is the fast and easiest way of checking all your favorite sports and events, including MMA, boxing, and golf. Head to the website today or use a mobile device to learn more about the trends in action. BetOnline, where the game starts. All right, it is time to continue the show in a moment. We're looking at the Ravens' big question in the backfield. Which NFL stars move the betting line the most? Starting July 18th, Locked On gives you the 50 most valuable players in the NFL from the odds maker at BetOnline. It's available July 18th on Locked On NFL, wherever you get your podcasts, and on YouTube, much like Locked On Fantasy Football. All right, it is time to continue the show and break down the Baltimore Ravens. And the question in the backfield, do we trust J.K. Dobbins to be healthy right away in week 1? And do we believe he's an RB2? So it's a two-part question here with J.K. Dobbins. Very quiet so far with his progress reports from his knee injury. It was devastating because you lost J.K. Dobbins in the preseason, then you also lost Gus Edwards. So you had 2 backs go down. You had to scramble to get answers between Devonta Freeman, Latavius Murray, Le'Veon Bell, others that you worked into the mix that kind of faded here. So it was hard. The Ravens had to find answers very quickly when they had good depth at that position. Last year, they also had Justice Hill, and he was banged up as well. So that's something that we can't forget about. Right now, the depth chart reads J.K. Dobbins, Gus Edwards, Mike Davis. So Mike Davis went from the Panthers, was a pretty good fantasy football fill-in for Christian McCaffrey. Then went to the Falcons. Everyone was hot on him following that Panthers production to be an RB2. What happened? The Cordell Patterson situation happened. So now Mike Davis moves into this mix, and he's a capable backup. We know that. So probably the Ravens saying, look, we think Dobbins and Edwards are on track, but we want to give ourselves a bit of an experience edge there ahead of Justice Hill. And that's what you saw. Mike Davis, the South Carolina product, has bounced around, has been on the 49ers, Seahawks, so has some experience there behind those younger backs. And Dobbins and Edwards are pretty much like that right now. Now, when Gus Edwards is in there, he's pretty much a standard league guy that you hope that can produce something in the way of flex production with his scoring ability and rushing totals here. But Dobbins is a guy that really they had high hopes for last year before he went down, that not only was he going to be an explosive runner, give them potential to average 5.0 or more yards per carry, really play off well of Jackson's quickness, speed, and explosiveness, but also be an asset as a receiver. So that's another element that's going to help Jackson, is having a reliable receiver at the backfield. Dobbins can excel in screen passes, so you get him out in the open field. uses speed and quickness there, he can be very effective. So Dobbins, again, not being out there was another factor to put more pressure on Jackson and didn't quite come through. And he had that injury there rolling out of the pocket. So when you look at Dobbins, the intention is to get him on the field by week 1. Now, that's a good goal. A lot of these teams are not satisfied unless they see this player with a major knee rehab out there in the preseason and take meaningless reps. Well, Ravens are too smart for that. They're just waiting for J.K. Dobbins to be fully healthy because they trust his knowledge of the offense and what his role is going to be, that he'll pick up where he left off there in 2021 before he had an actual chance to play in the regular season. So they're confident in Dobbins, and I think, again, the goal is just being out there in week 1. That's what we want fantasy. Don't rush the guy back. Don't risk a chance of re-injury here in camp or preseason action when the snaps don't mean anything for our purposes. So, again, I think as long as things are quiet and they are still on track with the goal for Dobbins to be out there in week 1 of the regular season, we got to feel pretty confident about that. And again, you got to feel really confident about Dobbins and what he can do this offense. Again, playing off a running quarterback always helps. Upgraded offensive line with some youth, more athleticism in front. Still have a threat of the downfield passing game enough for people to be concerned to open up the short to intermediate routes where Dobbins and Mark Andrews can operate. So really, I am invested highly and very interested in him as an RB2 this season. Dobbins and some people may be off him, and you're going to take advantage of those guys and gals that are just saying, okay, I don't want a guy coming off knee injury. But if there's no signs that he's breaking down or he's going to have a setback, and keeping in mind that he's a young back, he hasn't had a lot of time in this league. He was in that crowded backfield a couple of years ago that hinted at what he could do coming out of Ohio State. He finally got the opportunity down the stretch, and it looked like all his last year. So the Ravens have some continuity there with the Harbaugh and Roman to say that Dobbins is going to seamlessly transition when fully healthy and running at full speed. So that's the main thing we're looking for. If there's any reports of him just running at full speed, it doesn't matter if he gets the actual reps. They trust him. They know what he's going to do. And that's all we want, to be out there week 1. And again, you might be able to get a better value on him now before there's a little bit more clarity and definition of exactly when he can return. But I would still think it is week 1 at this very time. All right, we will get into our big question in the Ravens receiving core in our final segment here on Locked On Fantasy Football. We do have to tell you about an exciting new sponsor. It is Dave. Level with me. We've been in a situation at some point in our lives when we're a little tight on cash. It's natural. I mean, things happen in our lives where we just have to react to them. And with Dave, it's going to be help from your future you. That's where Dave can help you. We could only maybe afford to put a few gallons of gas in our tank, especially if we've got another save the date and wondering how you're going to afford a gift for the wedding. If you're living paycheck to paycheck or struggling to make ends meet, it can be really stressful when unexpected expenses come up. Now, Dave can help you get out of pinch when you really need it. Hindsight is 2020, and you can't change the past. What if you could get help from your future self? Maybe you'd ask to borrow a little cash. Well, now you can with Dave. Dave is the banking app that can help you get up to $500 instantly with extra cash. There's more money to fill your tank, buy a wedding gift, or catch up on bills. You can finally tackle those expenses that have been stressing you out without any hangups. There's no interest and no credit check needed. Millions of people have already downloaded the Dave app to get the financial relief they need with extra cash. So if you're in a pinch and need some extra help, download Dave and think of it as a helping hand from future you. Download the Dave app from the App Store right now. That's Dave, D-A-V-E, like the name. Sign up for an extra cash account and get up to $500 instantly. For terms and conditions, go to dave.com/legal. Instant transfer fees apply. Banking provided by Evolve, member FDIC. Dave, future you will thank you. All right, it is time to close the show and look at our biggest question with the Ravens wide receiver core here. We'll focus on that. There's no question with Mark Andrews and tight end. He's still elite and in the prime of his career. The numbers are going to keep coming there. But what do we do at wide receiver here for the Ravens? Well, There's one clear answer. It's Rashad Bateman. We talked about him. He's a first-round pedigree. It was easy to move Hollywood Brown because of Bateman. I think he showed a little bit last year. There was a Bengals game at home where I thought he may have proved himself being a potential number one in this league. He was a great receiver at the University of Minnesota. Didn't get enough credit, I think. He kind of dominated the Big Ten, profiling as a number one. So you can do a little bit of everything, can stretch the field when needed. Nice target in the red zone, good hands, good routes, all that good stuff that you want to have the success with in the NFL. And the best part here, there's Mark Andrews. We know a tight end, and he's going to be the apple of Lamar Jackson's eye there with the way they run their offense and intermediate routes. But Bateman is kind of a plus from that. And there's no one else that you would say is reliable at wide receiver. I think it's going to be more by committee with Duvernay and Prochet and some of the younger guys that they have to help complement these guys stretching the field and making big plays. But when it comes to what Bateman can do, I think there's no limitation. I think there is that ability to make those big plays and stretch on the perimeter. He's a very good outside target here. Can go up and get the ball. And again, when Andrews has attention in the red zone, it's going to really help get open here. So, and not a high volume passing offense. So you don't need a lot of weapons. And that's where they figured that Brown was a little bit expendable here, especially if Dobbins and Edwards were on the mend to help Jackson in the running game. So all these things definitely factored here for the Ravens in making this decision. So a lot of good stuff there for sure that Bateman can tap into. And the vacated targets don't hurt without Brown and others here. So he's the veteran guy on this team right now going into the season that he can be trusted. Duvernay and Prochet right around the same years entering the league, but they don't have nearly enough experience as a receiver the way that Bateman does. And it was a little bit slow for Bateman to be fully healthy last year, but once he was there and a good part of the offense, he was involved, and I think that's what they want to do, involve him even more. And the way to do that, it's forcing the ball downfield to Hollywood Brown, is to streamline Bateman into the number one role and have him play off the running game more effectively and what Andrews can do. So Bateman is going to get favorable coverage as well. You figure it's going to be a natural tendency for teams to focus and take away Andrews from Jackson first. So that'll help Bateman as well. And I think, again, Hollywood Brown would struggle with that a little bit because he was a field stretcher and needed speed and vertical nature of his routes to deliver that way. But Rashad Bateman is not that player. So, look, you have to be careful with Rashad Bateman. It's not a high volume passing team, as we mentioned. They're not going to just explode and throw it all around. It's not like we have this being the Bengals, our team up next year, where three receivers can be sustained here in a high passing offense here with Joe Burrow, Lamar Jackson running, playing off Dobbins and Edwards. Those things are going to be more important here for what Baltimore essentially wants to do, play off their defense as well. Their secondary is excellent. So their defense is rebuilt to the point where defense and running game is still going to be the bread and butter and backbone of how the Ravens win a lot of games. But Bateman, when they throw it, he's a great position there to dominate targets along with Andrews. So keep that in mind. And again, sometimes you don't want too many weapons. If it's not a team that throws a lot, you want fewer weapons. If you have several mouths to feed and it's by committee here, it can get frustrating and no one player can stand out for the wide receiver core. But Bateman is meant to do that. So for fantasy, we'll see about Hollywood Brown and think his value will definitely bump up. Reuniting with Kyler Murray, especially DeAndre Hopkins, suspended there for the early part. They're going to have to throw to him quite a bit. Not a lot of options there. So it actually could help both these guys a lot. I think Brown and Bateman together in a team not passing enough was very kind of frustrating for fantasy managers, but now you don't have that. Bateman and Brown can go their separate ways and produce differently with quarterbacks that are going to key in and target them pretty well here in 2022. So a lot of positivity with the Ravens. Lamar Jackson, yeah, he has that high QB1 overall ceiling. You got J.K. Dobbins, feels really good as an RB2 coming back from the injury. Gus Edwards, more of a flex play behind him. And Rashad Bateman, again, where do we settle on his value? I think it's going to be a little bit aggressive to just say he's going to be in the top 24 and finish as wide receiver 2. But if you're looking for a solid wide receiver 3 that's probably going to have steady production, I think that's where you're looking at Bateman's role. And again, Hollywood Brown, it was hard for him, remember, to break in and be consistent as wide receiver 3. So just by not getting enough targets, that's going to be a concern for Bateman. But again, you want some consistency, and you're not looking for a world beater. You're just looking for someone to be involved in their offense, have a good shot for 5 catches, 75 yards, somewhere in that range on a weekly basis. And Bateman will be in that conversation. That's the type of receiver he is. Here, and it'll vary. Some weeks he'll have some bigger weeks, especially if he can involve a touchdown. Some are going to be pretty mild weeks, but I don't think he's going to go away as a key target in this offense playing off Andrews. All right, there you have it. There's a breakdown there of the Baltimore Ravens, the 3 key fantasy football questions facing them going into training camp and preseason here in 2022. So good to break them down. Next up will be the Bengals. So a lot of exciting offenses to talk about here in this division. So really happy to get to the AFC North, get to these teams. And if you missed any of the previous teams we broke down, check them out. They're out there on our archives on Locked On Fantasy Football, wherever you get your podcast, as well as on YouTube. Thanks again for listening and making Locked On Fantasy Football your first listen today. Now make your second listen the Locked On NFL podcast. Our national NFL experts and insiders keep fans dialed in with the biggest stories and latest news from around the league, because an offseason doesn't equal a break in the action. For Locked On Fantasy Football, this has been Vinnie Iyer. Have a great day, and see you next time as we break down the key questions for the 2022 Cincinnati Bengals.